Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's North Carolina Botanical Garden Lunchbox Talk. We're glad to have you joining us virtually today. I'm Joanna Lalikas, the Director of Education at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. And today we're bringing you Bob, Peet, and Fisher Stines, who will be sharing with us about the Redlair Preserve and its wonderful Bigleaf Magnolia and broader plant communities. So we do hope if you're in the area, you'll come visit us at the garden. We are open Tuesday through Sunday, and our exhibit hall and our garden shop are now open to the public again too. So this program is offered in partnership with the Friends of Plant Conservation. We've partnered with them again this year with paired offerings of lunchbox talks and excursions to some of North Carolina's most beautiful natural areas. We have 3 on the schedule so far, and we are planning for one more in 2021. We scheduled the Redlair and the Souther Prairie excursions on the same weekend, Saturday and Sunday. So if you're interested in spending a weekend in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg greater region, consider attending both of those. You can register for any of these via our events calendar, and there's still room in all programs. I'd like to take a moment to thank our Spring 2021 Lunchbox Talk event hosts, Sims Preston and Olympia Stone, for supporting our Spring Lunchbox Talk series at the Dogwood level. Lunchbox Talk event hosts provide funds that support program planning, that help us reach a broad and diverse audience, including support for captioning any recordings that we do of the programs. So Robert Peet joined the faculty of UNC Chapel Hill in 1975, where he taught plant ecology and plant geography until he retired in 2018. His research interests and work have included factors influencing the composition, species diversity, and long-term dynamics of terrestrial plant communities across the region. He and his colleagues have documented the compositional variation of Carolina vegetation with extensive field work that now provides the basis for vegetation classification and also informs conservation and management of natural lands. He's had a long-term interest in the Redlair Preserve. He's visited the property regularly over the last 30 years, and he currently chairs the Redlair Stewardship Committee for the Plant Conservation Program. Now, Fisher Stines is an undergraduate student at NC State University, but not for much longer. He's graduating in May. He is majoring in plant biology and German studies. He spent the summer of 2019 at the Redlair Preserve, collecting data on the distribution and population structure of the Bigleaf Magnolia. And that data will be essential for future population monitoring. He's currently using those data as the core of an undergraduate research project documenting the abundance and dynamics of bigleaf across the preserve. He's been working with the Plant Conservation Program for the past year and will continue through the next year after graduation. So Bob and Fisher, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll hand it off to Bob now.
Okay, well, greetings. It's my pleasure to be here today and to tell you about Bigleaf Magnolia and the Redlair Preserve. Bigleaf Magnolia is probably one of our most charismatic North American trees. It certainly has the largest leaves of any of the trees in our country, and it has giant flowers, and I surely hope you get to enjoy it. The Redlair Preserve is a preserve of the Plant Conservation Program of the Department of Agriculture. These preserves are to protect rare species within the state, and the PCP goes to great lengths to monitor and maintain these preserves. And the Friends of Plant Conservation is a nonprofit that helps them. I thought we might start by just having a quick poll to see how many of you have encountered Bigleaf Magnolia before. So Lauren, could you give us a quick poll? Have you seen it in the wild in North Carolina? Have you seen it in the wild but not North Carolina? Have you seen it only in cultivation, or have you perhaps not even seen it? Something to look forward to. It's not very common in North Carolina, so to see it in the wild would be exceptional, but there are a number of populations over near Charlotte and maybe some tinier ones elsewhere, like near Raleigh. All right, we seem to have some results. And it looks like a few people have actually seen it in the wild, 30%, and maybe 50% have seen it in cultivation when it's fairly common in gardens. So thank you for responding. So certainly I'm going to focus a bit on the Redlair Preserve, which was set up to protect this species. And it has the biggest population of bigleaf east of the Appalachians. Now I have to make sure I can work my system here. There we go. Okay, everything's working. I'm going to give you a bit of a tour of both where bigleaf occurs and some of its attributes, and then we'll let Fisher tell you about the population at Redlair, and then I'll come back and tell you more about Redlair as time permits. So at Redlair, we have this huge population, and it grows largely on cool slopes, sheltered locations. The population expanded greatly following Hurricane Hugo back in 1989, because it's largely an understory tree, and when we thinned out the canopy, it responded very happily, unlike most species of trees at that time. So here is a map of the general region. Here's the Charlotte, let's see if I can get my mouse over there. Here's the, can you see this all right, I trust?
Yes.
Lauren? Here's the Charlotte airport. Here's I-85. So if you want to get to Redlair from the Triangle area, just hop on 85 and head past Charlotte, cross the Catawba River, get off at the second exit, and you can get up to the Redlair Preserve fairly easily. We have two areas here. We have the core of this area, which is the Redlair Preserve in the middle of this orange area. And the orange area is the greater Redlair area preserved by the Catawba Lands Conservancy. There's both the 700-acre Redlair Preserve and a total of 1,200 acres preserved in this region. And we aspire to someday maybe even preserving Spencer Mountain, which is this big hill you see as you're driving down 85 and looking ahead. And that would be a nice addition someday. If you're going to come here for the tour on the 8th, you just hop on 85. It's about 150 miles from the Botanical Garden. And if you want to do both the Prairie on Sunday and Redlair on Saturday, it's about 50 miles back to, so they're from the Redlair Preserve. So I would like to tell you a little bit about the history of Redlair. Here we have a map of the travels of André Michaux back in the late 1700s, a great French explorer of the botany of the New World. He published the first flora of this part of the world back in 1803. It was released. And he discovered this plant, Bigleaf Magnolia, as the first botanist to think about it. I think he was in 1789, though there are earlier descriptions in his travels that might or might not be this. And the name was officially published in 1803. Certainly he sent a lot of plants back to the old world, to France. I understand there's some 90 cases of plants went back, and in 1796, he sent some big leaves back to Europe, some of which ended up in the garden of the Empress Josephine, who was the first wife of Napoleon. So he did some reciprocal things by giving us some plants too. So Camellia and Crepe Myrtle arrived here, compliments of Andre. Now, whoops, wrong direction here. Compliments of Charlie Williams, who I think is listening in here and who knows a lot more about bigleaf than I do, so he can correct all my errors later. We have a new book that came out, which gives the transcription of his journals and letters. It was published just last year, and it weighs more than you'd want to carry around. and I recommend it if you want to know more about Michaud's travels. Here on the left is the type collection that Michaud sent back to France from his travels in North America. One of two from the area near Charlotte that he returned. So let's look a little bit about the Bigleaf Magnolia in the broad sense. First, I have a map here of bigleaf and counties where it has been recorded. Some of these are undoubtedly a consequence of humans parking them there since they're such charismatic plants. But we have some natural populations over here in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area, mostly along the South Fork of the Catawba River. There's a bigger population west of the Appalachians, particularly in Alabama and Mississippi and a bit in Tennessee. So that's its sort of range. We're quite wondering why it's in this area around Charlotte, but we don't know. That's where it was first found. It has some close relatives, which if you want to be including lots of subspecies into species, we have a thing called Magnolia ashii down in the panhandle of Florida. It's a very rare thing, looks just like bigleaf, except it's more bushy and grows on a few cool slopes. And then we have some populations that are closely related down on the escarpment of the mountains in Mexico. So there are somewhere between 1 and 5 species down here. Sometimes it's just Dilobata. Sometimes it's broken more recently into 5 things, little populations. And these are typical of a bunch of species of our eastern forests, which have disjunct populations down there in the Mexican escarpment, probably left over from before the glacial period when these forests were more widespread. So you can go down there and see beech trees and sweet gums and ironwoods and sugar maples and a bunch of flowering dogwoods, a bunch of things down there that you are familiar with, but very small populations. Now, next, I'd like to look at some species which are very similar in their ranges in that they have populations along the Piedmont of North Carolina and adjacent places. And here are 3 of them. You see in the lower left, the closest magnolia to bigleaf, the umbrella magnolia, a little bit more widely distributed. And you see 2 other tree species which seemingly have Piedmont populations, but bigger populations similarly down in Mississippi and Alabama area. And here are a few other species which are sort of peculiar in that they have populations that are sort of centered near Charlotte in some way. The first of these that I have up is the Schweinett Sunflower, which is only on the prairies near Charlotte. This is its native range. I have a Piedmont indigo bush, which is also limited to that area. And I have the Camas lily, which, while widespread in the West, has just a couple populations in the Carolinas. And all of these things have very limited soil attributes that they're associated with. Schweinetts and Camas are on places typically having high concentrations of cations like calcium and magnesium. The indigo bush is on rocky, isolated peaks for the most part. So we have limited soil attributes. They also have limited habitats in that they're mostly somewhat more open places. And they might be in some way influenced by humans. Schweinett sunflower, some people have suggested, might have been a consequence of humans cultivating certain big sunflowers for the tuberous roots. It's one of the very few with tuberous roots which could be eaten. So maybe humans are involved. And the Camas lily, these 2 populations that we have in the Carolinas are closely associated with old Indian settlements, which were well developed. And we know the Indians dug up the roots of these things for food. So they probably were brought in by humans. So interesting plants over there near Charlotte. Okay, now we're on the Redlair Preserve do we find these things? This map that I have for you is the Redlair Preserve. The green part is the preserve, the strict sense, owned by the Plant Conservation Program. And the other shaded areas are part of Greater Redlair, protected in some way by the Catawba lands. And the shaded orange or yellow are where we have bigleaf on the property. And they're typically on a steep topography, and they probably were originally protected from the fires of the original landscape, which came out of the west and ran into the Catawba River, which is deeply incised here. How they got here? Well, maybe they are relics from pre-glacial periods. Maybe they were brought in by birds. Birds love red seeds, they eat them, and they maybe came in from Alabama and pooped here. Maybe even humans brought them in because they're neat plants. We know that there are Indians living here. They farm these areas along the river where we can find relics of Indian activity today. So we don't know quite where they're there, but we've got them and they're wonderful plants. Now, briefly, let me tell you a little bit about Redlair Preserve per se. The Redlair Preserve is land that was accumulated by Forney Rankin when he moved back into this region after his service with the federal government down in Latin America. He liked to accumulate land there. He had grown up in the region and just kept adding on to his property. His children, Haywood, Catherine, and Charles, convinced him and his wife to preserve the land by giving the Catawba Lands Conservancy conservation easements. His wife, Jean, named the place Redlair, and we're not sure quite why. There are three reasons hypothesized. Forney's nickname was Red, so he lived there. Everybody in the family had red hair, so maybe that's why it was. Or maybe it was just the eroded red clay of the uplands, which were so prominent when they got there. But anyway, all three of those are hypothesized. And along the way, the family wanted to do more to protect it. Catawba Lands wanted to do more to protect it, but it's a big hunk of land and it's expensive to maintain. And Catawba was a bit concerned about this. But in about 2011, we discovered that Plant Conservation Program had put bigleaf on its list of plants to protect, and chatted with Rob Evans, who's sitting here in the photograph on the left, and he wanted PCP to own the land. He thought it would be great. So the Plant Conservation Program applied for some funds from the Clean Water Trust Fund and the Heritage Fund, and acquired enough money to buy the land at half its value. The family at that point, Haywood, Catherine, and Charles, or Charles's estate, he died in the middle, sold the land at about half its value to the state. And then they took the money that they got and invested it in a fund at the Foundation for the Carolinas called the Redlair Fund or Foundation, which is dedicated to maintaining and preserving this property in perpetuity. So it's one of the very few properties that PCP owns where we have a means of protecting it in perpetuity already funded. So with that, I might say that the land is well taken care of as a third layer of protection above the conservation easements and state ownership. UNC Charlotte has developed a research center there, so it's becoming very important from a science perspective, the Redlair Observatory. And we have Haywood living on the property or next to it and maintaining it as a steward. So that's what we have going on there. And now I'm going to move over to Fisher, who's going to tell you about his research on the property.
All righty, thank you, Bob. We're going to go and get transitioned here. All right, so you should be able to see my screen there. All right. So first, I'd just like to tell you what a pleasure it is to speak with all of you this afternoon about a plant that I care very deeply about and at a place that I care very deeply about. So to begin, I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of this project. So I went to Forest View High School, which is a high school in the region And Sabina Rankin, Haywood's wife, was my teacher there. So I'd had a connection to this property and was volunteering there for some time. And then when I went to NC State, I was a bit unsure about what I wanted to do. Like many people interested in science, I was initially drawn to medicine, but the more and more I got into botany, I was just completely in love with it. And this was really sort of my beginning story where I was able to do some really interesting research and decide to pursue botany as my main major. So certainly this was a project that was underlined by partnership. So we mentioned about the two major landholders involved here, the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program and the Catawba Lands Conservancy. And they've both been extremely supportive of the property and of me as well, and sort of helping me get to my place in botany. And this is also part of a research project at NC State, which I'm doing for my bachelor's thesis. So this is certainly an important project to me and one that I've been working on for a few years now. So the main objectives of the research were first to establish some sort of a long-term monitoring infrastructure. So if you happen to take a dive into the Bigleaf Magnolia literature, almost every single study begins with, well, we don't know very much about this plant. And one really useful piece of data would be sort of a long-term monitoring set where we can begin to better understand how this population is moving, how it's responding to things like climate change, or perhaps some other factors. And in the short term, I'm looking at the dynamics of the Bigleaf Magnolia population at Redlair. Is this population expanding? Are all of the efforts done by Haywood and his crew, they're benefiting the Bigleaf Magnolia in some measurable way? And also looking at the structure of the botanical communities at Redlair and seeing how the Bigleaf Magnolia plays a role within those communities. So I'll tell you a bit about the experimental design now. And this photo here at the left, I believe you can see my cursor. You can see all of these orange dots. And basically, these are 50 meters apart from one another. And this would represent a grid that exists across the entire preserve. Now, whenever Bob was showing you earlier the areas where the Bigleaf Magnolia were located, they also follow roughly the same path. So we've come up with sort of a funny name for these as blobules or blobogons. There's some sort of a shape for these Bigleaf Magnolia populations. And then this grid was then superimposed upon those, and then these are considered candidate sites. So all in all, there's quite a few different candidate sites here. And those that are white are those that weren't taken. And altogether, I went out over the course of the summer of 2019 and surveyed 70 of these plots in all of the major populations. So with that, we have a pretty good idea of what the Bigleaf Magnolia is doing in each of these subsets of the population. And this is sort of this notion of the stratified sample, in that it wasn't purely random, but we wanted to get a better idea of the whole preserve. And now I'll tell you a little bit about some of the data that we took. So this is sort of the typical scene here. We'd go out into the landscape and we'd put in 4 permanent marker posts on each of the corners, and we lay these meter tapes down. And this is extremely important because we're actually going to develop a coordinate system where we can measure and track each individual stem of the Bigleaf Magnolia over time. So say I come back in 5 years or 10 years, I can go to the coordinate on this axis, and I can measure this Bigleaf Magnolia and see how it's grown and changed over time. So that's some really interesting information. We're collecting some site variables here, talking about its position on the slope, maybe its proximity to this little stream down here, the slope and aspect of the area. And then we're also going to be doing some measurements of the Bigleaf Magnolia. So here I have 2 phenomenal volunteers, Corey Rogers and Kate Allison. Each of them were so very helpful throughout this project, and they were doing a lot of the measurements. So for those Bigleaf Magnolias that were below breast height, it's about 4.5 feet, we are going to be getting a height as sort of the proxy of how these are doing. And we're doing this with the Biltmore stick here. And then for those that were larger, we would use the same device here, but we'd measure those diameters. And that was a better indicator of size and the fitness of that plant at that area. Here we have Corey again here, measuring some of those occurring woody species with the Biltmore stick, again, in a different place here. So that was basically the idea of the project, just going out, measuring a couple of these different stems and trying to draw a few conclusions about how the Bigleaf Magnolia population is doing at Redlair. So there are a few things that we observed sort of, anecdotally first, and then that can then be backed up with the hard data. But I'll show you here, this is a really interesting way to look at the topography of Redlair. And what I'll draw your attention to is sort of this line here. This is the South Fork of the Catawba River, and this is that main influencing factor. So we mentioned that there, most of these Bigleaf Magnolia populations are distributed along this river, and a lot of it has to do with the topography. So this is Redlair here, and you can see just how many of these, deep ravines run into the watershed here. And the Bigleaf Magnolia population almost always are found on the north-facing slope of these steep ravines. So why might that be, right? So if we look then at this graph here, we can see that almost 50% of them are growing on a north-facing slope. Then another 25% are in this eastern direction. So 75% of the Bigleaf Magnolia populations are growing on the north to northeastern facing slope of these deeply cut ravines. Bob already mentioned that might have something to do with fire, but it also has to do with the wind direction in the region. So if you imagine you have these leaves that are the biggest, largest simple leaf of any tree in all of North America. I mean, these things are huge, can get up to 3 feet long sometimes. If you're sort of a big parachute, wind is your enemy. So we want to find nice sheltered ravines and with proximity to some sort of a moisture to prevent drying out. So this is a potential reason that we find them here on these north-facing slopes. They also were almost always in very well-drained slopes. We can see here at the interquartile range that the slopes were between 8 and 20 degrees. So sometimes it was really difficult to measure these things because you're falling down the hill. Sort of our maximum here was at 35 degrees. I mean, these are some really interesting plants and where they grow. So just understanding what these slopes look like and where they're found gives us some information about the Bigleaf Magnolia's niche in that habitat and what we might look for in potential restoration efforts. As Bob mentioned earlier, the Bigleaf Magnolia has sort of a peculiar distribution in the Carolinas in that it represents this eastern and sort of northeastern extent of the range outside of the core range to the west, and potentially, the soils might be what's leading to this. So this is a bit of a busy figure here, but I'll point your attention up here in the northwest. The colors are a little bit different, and this represents the Tatum gravelly loam. So this is derived from a completely different underlying geological series. This is the Kings Mountain Belt, and then you have the Charlotte Belt here in the south. The Tatum gravelly loam is sort of an interesting population or sort of interesting soil series in that the plants that grow here are predominantly xeric species. So very dry, rocky soils here. A lot of mountain chestnut oaks are growing here in this region. And it's a far cry from what we'd see here in the south, where it's predominantly very rich mesic soils. Also, the Congaree loam here, I'll point you to, is what's going along the river, sort of the river floodplain. And the Bigleaf Magnolia does grow here, but not nearly as well. So you can see that the core concentration is occurring on this Pacolet sandy loam. So going with this, that the soils might be a potential cause for the Bigleaf Magnolia to be doing well at Redlair. I took a look at the highest performing plots. And what I mean by that is those that had the greatest numbers of regeneration of juvenile plants, and also those that had very large mature areas. They almost always occurred on soils that had more basic pHs. So this circumneutral pH of around 5.6, 5.7. There was a very high base saturation of those cations. So there was quite a bit of calcium, quite a bit of manganese, and sometimes there was a lot of phosphorus. So all of these are really important nutrients and might explain why the Bigleaf Magnolia is doing so well at Redlair and perhaps not in other areas. And then, of course, in the moderate to low performing plots, this is more indicative of what we'd see across the broader Piedmont. More acidic pHs, the soils are not nearly as rich. But one interesting thing is that the manganese levels remain high. So there might be a potential manganese correlation there, but that would require further testing to understand that fully. Okay, now to finally get down to talking a little bit about the plants that grow there. So I mentioned we measured all of the co-occurring woody species. And I'll draw your attention to sort of these three at the top first. So American beech, red maple, and American holly. These were all over the place. And it's really not an indicator so much as to say that it's just what's occurring across the broad Piedmont. But if we start looking down a little bit further at these plants that were growing in a very high concentration relative to the other plots, but not quite as high as the American beech, for example, it tells us a bit more about what's going on. So I'll highlight a couple of indicator species here. This white ash down here at the bottom, northern red oak, musclewood, and the chalk maple are all plants that are pretty happy in more mesic environments, and they're also sometimes indicative of more basic soils, certainly with the chalk maple, which we happen to have the national champion of at Redlair. So all of these species are telling us that, okay, this species prefers to be in more moist environments. It likes richer soils, And this is an important takeaway for us. So now to talk about a couple of the community types that the Bigleaf Magnolia is found in, and Bob will talk about this in a bit more detail later. But just to give you an idea of where the Bigleaf Magnolia are occurring most frequently, it's almost always in these mesic mixed hardwood forests. And this is coming from Michael Shafley's fourth approximation, where he goes out and attempts to describe all of the different types of communities in the Carolinas. A couple indicators here, we see quite a bit of American beech, we see quite a few red maples. The soils, though, here are a bit more acidic, not quite as rich as we'd see in other places. And certainly the Bigleaf Magnolia is happy here as an understory tree. Where the Bigleaf Magnolia is happiest are in these dry basic oak tree forests and sort of these more basic varieties of the mesic forests. The main thing just to take away here is that soil chemistry really does make a difference. And the greatest stands of Bigleaf Magnolia that are the most mature and are regenerating at the highest rates are in these dry basic oak tree forests. One thing I'll point your attention to in this back little corner here, there's quite a bit of sunlight coming in. And the Bigleaf Magnolia is certainly a gap opportunist. And when these canopy breaks open up, the Bigleaf Magnolia is one of the very first ones to colonize. They'll jump from these sort of small 10 to 15 centimeter plants all the way up to breast height within a matter of a year or two. And they are really doing quite well in these areas. One that's a bit different, though, is the Piedmont Heath Bluff community. And this is one that's certainly more acidic, and it's dominated by this mountain laurel that grows here. These are also extremely steep slopes. And these make for some of the most beautiful vistas at Redlair, in my personal opinion, that you get beautiful views of the Catawba River, and you also get these amazing stands of the Bigleaf Magnolia behaving almost like you're in a jungle. I mean, you look up and you see this canopy, and it is just truly amazing. So if you happen to be able to join us for the excursion, we'll certainly take you to one of these communities, and you can see the Bigleaf Magnolia in its greatest glory. I don't want to go too deeply into the different types of communities here, but the main takeaway from this slide is to understand that the Bigleaf Magnolia is doing extremely well at Redlair. It's expanding, and it's found in quite a variety of different community types. And some of those might be community types that it really doesn't belong to in the proper sense. Certainly this Piedmont monadnock forest here. Again, this is occurring on that Tatum gravelly loam. The soils are much drier, they're much rockier, they're far less rich. And this would be an area that would traditionally be maintained by fire. And as a matter of fact, we recently did a controlled burn in this area, and we're tracking the way that the Bigleaf Magnolia responds to the fires there. So certainly, though, the Bigleaf Magnolia is expanding outward from its sort of core range in the central part of Redlair. To show you a couple of graphs here talking about the way the Bigleaf Magnolia is growing, you can see that this is for those Bigleaf Magnolias that are small. These are kind of in the juvenile range, and they're all below 4.5 feet. And it's a pretty normal population in that we have quite a bit of recruitment here. We have quite a few seedlings, and then that gradually drops off. Now, there's a bit of a carryover, though. At around 75 centimeters to 140 centimeters, it seems like these plants jump pretty quickly in height, and then we pick them up on the next graph, which is going to be those of the more mature Bigleaf Magnolia. So our measurement style has changed here a bit. So we've gone from measuring heights of small trees to measuring the diameter at breast height of larger trees. So these Bigleaf Magnolias can become quite high, and it was difficult to measure the mature ones. So this was a better indicator for us, and it was a bit more efficient. So as I mentioned, sort of from that 75 to 145 centimeter group, we pick them up all here in this 1 centimeter class. So all of a sudden they jump up in height, and then it sort of levels off here around the 2 to 3 centimeter mark. And this is pretty consistent up until around the 17 centimeter mark. Whenever it goes off gradually, the Bigleaf Magnolia is not an incredibly long-lived tree, so they might just be dying off. But also there could be some disturbance events like Hurricane Hugo that occurred in the past, where there were some very violent winds, and that could have actually damaged the population at Redlair of the more mature trees, while allowing those young recruits to grow to more of a substantial size. The one other thing that's really fascinating about the Bigleaf Magnolia is its strategy for regrowth, in that we really don't know quite how old these Bigleaf Magnolia are, because they're very difficult to core and measure, because oftentimes the inner part of the tree will be rotted. But also, whenever a bigleaf magnolia is knocked down, it often sends up root sprouts from the base. So the rootstock of that bigleaf magnolia might be quite older than the standing trunk. So that'd be some really interesting research if we could find a way to understand, really how old this bigleaf magnolia population is at Redlair. We certainly know that it was around in the 18th century, but we really don't know much before that. So now, sort of coming to the end here, I'd like to thank a couple of people for all of their help throughout this project. I was really struggling to find some help in the very beginning, and this group of volunteers came through and made this project possible. So we have Kyle Stout here. He's now working with Haywood at Redlair, doing a great job managing the property there. We have a few people from Gaston County Schools joining us, and I think that they certainly enjoyed it. So I'd like to ask you a quick question and see if any of you have participated in citizen science efforts before, and see that really quickly. So Lauren, could you launch that poll, please? Okay, excellent. So it's looking like the vast majority of you have participated in a citizen science project before, and that is just absolutely wonderful. Certainly one of these things as a young student, I didn't know that botany was such an amazing discipline until I was a little bit older. And just the opportunity to participate in these citizen science projects teach everyone so much about the landscape. It allows professionals to interact with the public, and we all learn something very, very valuable from each other. So I'm so glad to see that many of you have participated in these efforts before. Just to go through again here, just a couple more pictures. We certainly had quite a bit of fun during this project. And here, Haywood is standing in as one of our corner posts, helping out Andy Kane from the Catawba Lands Conservancy establish this plot here. And we had just a wonderful time doing this project, and are looking forward to publishing these results fairly soon as the semester is over. All righty. And with that being said, the greatest take-home message that I can tell you is that the bigleaf magnolia population is secure and expanding at Redlair. The conservation efforts there are certainly successful, and we're seeing the bigleaf magnolia doing some really great things there. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Bob, and he'll go into a little bit more depth about the Redlair Preserve itself.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Fisher. That was great. And I'm so glad we have science going on in this property. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Redlair and its biodiversity, and for that matter, its cultural diversity. When people think about nature in North Carolina, they often think about the mountains or the coastal fringe, where we have pretty well-developed national forests and conserved land. And the Piedmont's often ignored because it's been so developed, and we've had populations of people scattered over it for a long time, developing it. So it's sort of hard to find good places to see the diversity of Piedmont vegetation. And Redlair is exceptional in the range of variation it has. And one of the few places between the Uwharrie Mountains and the Blue Ridge that you can get a real diversity of Piedmont types. A number of things set the place off. It's large in extent. It's close to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area. It's only 8 miles as the crow flies from the Charlotte airport. It's topographically and geologically diverse. Fisher already mentioned that diversity, and part of it is a consequence of the geologic history of two chunks of continent running into each other there. The South Fork of the Catawba River is one of the few undammed pieces of river in the Piedmont. So that's exceptional. We have great biological diversity. I personally found 514 plant species there, and I'm sure there must be more than 600. There are a lot of different natural vegetation types as recognized by the Heritage Program, and Fisher mentioned some, and I'll mention others. We have 3 protected species here. The bigleaf, of course, but we also have the Schweinett Sunflower, which we've mentioned, and we have a small population of the state endangered Heller's rabbit tobacco. And finally, it's easy to forget that we have a long history of human occupation in this area. It's not all untouched. Various agricultural things have gone on there. And if you'd like to have a sense for the history of the Piedmont, just looking at the history of land use at Redlair, where bits and pieces remain of that history, can be fascinating. So a big tract of land sometimes offers surprises. And here are two surprises since we started trying to preserve the land. One was the discovery of Schweinett Sunflower. Lisa Gaffney discovered this back in 2002 when she was looking at plants on Redlair. She's a local botanist. And we didn't know it was there, but lo and behold, we had this state endangered and federally endangered species. And it was growing on a damaged tract of land. It was damaged historically by a farmer who lived there until the 1940s. And then it grew up to a pine growth, which was knocked over by Hurricane Fran. But for some reason, it managed to persist there. And we think it had to do with the unusual soils, the shrink swell clays that get wet when it rains and dry out and limits the competition of adjacent species. The second discovery was that we have the national champion of chalk maple, the biggest tree of this species in the country, in the world. And I had just been looking around Redlair and saw in 2018 the biggest one I'd ever seen. So I suggested that the state foresters come take a look at it and see if it's a state champion. And they did, but Catherine Rankin was along and she said, well, there's a bigger one just down the slope here. And it wasn't my tree that got the record, it was Catherine's. But here we have the biggest chalk maple in the world. So that was sort of fun too. Now here is a long list of vegetation types recognized by the Heritage Program. We don't need to go into great details here, but to understand the diversity of vegetation on the property, you need to think about three major gradients. One is moisture, where we have the alluvial forests along the South Fork of the Catawba River. We have seepage areas along small streams, and we have dry uplands. We have topographic position from sheltered, cool north slopes to dry, exposed southwest facing slopes. And we have soil conditions varying from very acidic to very base rich. So very quickly, dry oak hickory forests on the upland, the predominant thing of the Piedmont, crummy soils. Fisher mentioned the monadnocks. These are these high hills where tree competition is reduced due to thin soils. And we have here a few pines and oaks, which are open grown in character. Going downslope, we get dry mesic. Mesic means middle, so it's approaching moist, but not really yet. With oak hickory forests, go down slope a bit more, and we get the bigleaf on the sheltered sites. Down a bit more onto the really nutrient rich, where we had the black rock, as it were, intruding. And there we find enough nutrients to support lots of herb species. And it's here that on the spring day that you can see lots of things like the trout lilies, which are carpeting the ground here, or later in the summer, the maidenhair ferns here. So this is very rich in species owing to the underlying geology. Fisher mentioned the Heath bluffs, where we have Kalmia, the mountain laurel, dominating often, sometimes rhododendron. And then finally, we have these shrink swell clays, which were referred to as hardpan forests. I have a question mark here because I don't really know what it is in the state classification, because it's kind of a weird place. But surely it's kept open by these unusual soils, and it's kept open also by controlled burnings. And then finally down onto the alluvial plains, where the influence of the South Fork on a regular basis dictates the vegetation. I should point out we have some not so natural vegetation on some of the uplands. We have old field pines that have come in old ag lands. And we have areas that are still meadows and pastures, which are important for the biodiversity of the site. Whoops, skipped ahead a little bit too fast here. So the Plant Conservation Program has a number of challenges. They have to monitor the bigleaf, which Fisher told you about, make sure it's healthy, the same with the Schweinett's. being near a metropolitan area, we have lots of exotic species escaping from gardens. We have a problem of deer hunters are needed. We need to keep the deer herd under control. We need to keep the four-wheelers off the property, and we don't want excessive trespassing. And we need to keep the upland forests growing, which historically were maintained by fire. And we also have to figure out what to do with these upland areas to convert them into a more natural area. So just a little bit about monitoring here. This map of part of Redlair, you can see a lot of little dashed red lines in the background. Those are part of a path system. I won't say trail because we don't want lots of people walking on them, but they're a path system developed to monitor the property. And we have in excess of 100 miles of these little paths, which are routinely walked by Haywood or others to make sure nothing bad is going on. We have groups that come in to remove the exotics, which are unneeded and which suppress the native species. So here are some volunteers removing Russian olive in the upper right, or removing the little periwinkles that escaped from an old house site that was on the left-hand side of this picture. And many of the old houses of the 1800s had periwinkle growing around them. Now let me tell you something about the development of forests on the Piedmont, which is often not understood or appreciated. And that is the failure of our oaks and hickories to regenerate. The dominant trees of the Piedmont are not doing well in the sense that all the little trees under them are things like red maple or beech. And here are 3 pictures taken from the very same place in the Duke Forest. I can't show you pictures from 1936 in the Redlair Preserve, but this gives you the same concept. So here is a research plot. Here's tree 55, established back in 1936. And you can see it's fairly open, but lots of leaf area in that 1936 photograph, a fair number of little trees coming up. By the time you moved on to 1982, there aren't a lot of young oaks and hickories coming up, but there's still a lot of leaf area. And you can see here back in, here's tree 55, oops. If I hit the wrong key, I go backwards, unfortunately. So we'll go back and let you see again. Tree 55 is this tree. So this tree actually died. This tree has become this tree, which has become this tree. And now, since 1982, the understory is way open, and that's probably mostly due to deer. So we've got to watch out for deer. So getting all of these things to regenerate is a real challenge on properties like this. This is what we'd really like to be getting. This is a nutrient-rich site up in Virginia, which has had fire for more or less forever, since the early 1900s. So let's look at what PCP is doing. It's using fire to maintain the prairie area. That's the Schweinett's on the upper left, or the fire this spring where they are burning really mature oak hickory forest with no regeneration, with the idea that maybe we'll reburn it once, maybe every 4 years or so. Here's another activity that they maintain where the monitoring, counting the seedlings of the Schweinett Sunflower. And of course, we have to figure out what to do with these uplands. So in the interim, we're certainly keeping them open and keeping them from becoming scrubland. But ultimately, we'll probably want to make them into open savannas by maintaining them with fire and encouraging oak regeneration. Now, the final thing I wanted to mention is research on Redlair. And we have the group over at the UNC Charlotte, led by Missy Epps in their geology group, which has established the Redlair Observatory for maintaining science. This is a third level of protection beyond the plant conservation program, and that we do have now an active science program there. And if you want to learn more about it, you go to their website at redlair.org. Here is some of what she has been doing. It's a monitoring system for climate and hydrology. And we have on this map a series of wells, which are the purple things, of soil monitoring areas, which are marked in yellow, meteorological stations marked in blue, channel measurements of water flow in the streams. So all of this is being added to our knowledge of Redlair. We also have a lot of interest in land use history, and linked on the Redlair web page of the observatory, you can see a map system where you can actually slide back and forth and see how the land's changed from different periods of time. But here are two photographs from that of what the land looked like in 1938 and 2019. A long period of change, and you can see in these maps that there was actually quite a bit of open land back in 1938. Some areas were always forest, but there was a lot of cultivated land, which is now grown up and is recovering with bigleaf coming in. So that's yet another form of land transition. I'm going to skip over that slide. And one other kind of thing that we have been doing is looking at the impact of removal of exotic species. So here is a dissertation project where we're looking at a place where privet has invaded and been left, and a place where privet has been controlled, and we're similarly with Russian olive invading and being controlled. And Dennis Tracy, who did this work, found significant changes in the microclimate, that is the temperature and moisture and light, and in the recovery of regeneration of trees and of herb species. So with that, I'd like to thank you for participating in this conversation. I'll remind you that there's nothing like seeing the real thing, so we'd be delighted to have you join us in our field trip on May 8th, or perhaps then go on to Southern Prairie on the following day. And if you want to learn more, we have information available to you at the Redlair Observatory, at the Redlair Preserve portion of the Friends of Plant Conservation site. And both of those have links to this Redlair story map where you can interactively explore more about the property.
Thank you so much, Bob and Fisher, for sharing your knowledge and your time with us today. I really appreciate that. And Fisher, all the best to you with your continued work, your pending graduation, your continued work with the plant conservation program over the next year. We want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us. And again, join us for future virtual Lunchbox talks. Join us for the excursion of Bigleaf Magnolia at Redlair on May 8th, as well as consider Southern Prairie, the Green Swamp, and Boiling Springs, also upcoming this spring. If you're not currently a member, we hope you'll consider becoming a member. Also consider becoming a member of the Friends of Plant Conservation. Your membership is really critical to both organizations. So check out the links in the chat. And thank you again all for attending. I hope to see you in the garden.